"Everybody out, now." That's what a full-bird colonel said to a room of 40 people at a military armory open house. Marines, families, civilians, press. After looking at the chest of a 79-year-old man who had just walked through the door in dress blues and a steel cane, he didn't explain, he didn't apologise. He cleared the room in under 90 seconds and locked the door. Because the ribbon pinned above that old man's left breast pocket hadn't been issued since 1968. Fewer than 40 men had ever worn it, and most of them were dead. If you believe that some stories deserve to be heard even when they were never supposed to be told, type "honour" in the comments and stay until the end. Walter James Jessup had not worn his dress blues in 14 years. The last time had been 2012, the funeral of Master Sergeant Calvin Polk, who had served with Walter in 3 separate deployments and who had died in a VA hospital in San Diego from a cancer that the government said was unrelated to Agent Orange exposure, and that every man who had served with Cal Polk knew was a direct consequence of it. Walter had worn his blues to that funeral, because Cal would have noticed if he hadn't, and because the blues were the only language that said what Walter needed to say without requiring him to open his mouth. After the funeral, he'd hung them in the back of his closet in a garment bag with a cedar block, and hadn't touched them since. 14 years. He was 79 now, 5 feet 11 when he'd enlisted in 1963. Closer to 5'9" today, compressed by time and gravity and the particular erosion that decades of hard service inflict on a human spine. His left hip had been replaced in 2009, a titanium ball and socket that worked well enough on flat ground but turned stairs into a negotiation. His right hand had a tremor that came and went, worse in the mornings, better after his second cup of coffee, and his doctor attributed it to a combination of age and nerve damage sustained in an incident that existed in Walter's medical records as traumatic injury upper extremity 1968, with no further detail. The lack of detail was intentional. A great deal about Walter James Jessup's service record was intentionally lacking in detail. His cane was government issue, a standard aluminum adjustable model from the VOA pharmacy in Jacksonville, North Carolina, because Walter had never seen the point of buying what was given to him free, and because vanity was a quality he'd burned out of himself before his 25th birthday. He wore it without embarrassment. A cane was a tool. Tools served purposes, and Walter Jessup had never in his life been ashamed of using the right tool for the job. He lived in a small brick ranch house on a 1/4-acre lot in Hubert, North Carolina, 7 miles from the main gate of Marine Corps Base, Camp Lejeune. He had lived there since 1991, when he had retired from the Marine Corps as a sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank achieved by fewer than 1% of all Marines who serve. His wife, Marion, had chosen the house because it was close enough to the base commissary to be convenient and far enough from the flight line to sleep without earplugs. Marion had died in 2017, a stroke, sudden and complete, on a Tuesday afternoon while she was folding laundry. Walter had found her on the floor of the bedroom with a fitted sheet still in her hands, and he had sat beside her for 20 minutes before calling 911, not because he didn't understand what had happened, but because he needed those 20 minutes. He needed them the way a man needs air after being held underwater, not as a choice, but as a biological requirement. The grief was not something he discussed. It was something he carried, the way he carried the cane, visibly, constantly, without complaint. His days now were structured around maintenance. He maintained the house, he maintained the yard, he maintained his truck, a 2006 Chevrolet Silverado, with 180,000 miles that he serviced himself in the driveway. He maintained his body through daily walks and the stretching routine the VA physical therapist had prescribed, and he maintained his blues. This was the habit that would have seemed strangest to anyone who knew his daily life, because Walter Jessup had no reason to maintain a dress uniform he hadn't worn in 14 years, but every 3 months he removed the garment bag from the closet, unzipped it, inspected the uniform for moths or mildew, brushed the wool with a lint roller, checked the brass buttons for tarnish, and verified that every ribbon, every device, every pin was correctly positioned according to Marine Corps Order 1020.34, which governed the wearing of uniforms and insignia. He did this the way he had done everything in his career, with precision, with discipline, and with the understanding that readiness is not about probability but about principle. You maintain the uniform because the uniform deserves to be maintained. Whether you ever wear it again is beside the point. The invitation had arrived in September, a printed card in a cream-coloured envelope addressed to Sergeant Major Walter J. Jessup, USMC retired, from the commanding officer of the Camp Lejeune Armory Battalion. The card announced the annual Armory Heritage Open House, a public event held every October in which the base armory opened its doors to veterans, families and community members for guided tours, static displays of historic and current weapons systems, and presentations on the role of Marine Corps ordnance throughout history. The event was part of the base's ongoing community engagement program, and the invitation list included every retired senior enlisted Marine in the Jacksonville-Lejeune area. Walter had received one every year for the past 6 years. He had never attended, not because he objected to the event. He thought it was a fine thing bringing civilians onto a base and showing them what Marines did, but because Walter Jessup did not attend events, he did not socialize. He did not do gatherings, receptions, mixers, or any of the organized communal activities that the veterans organizations in the area offered with relentless good cheer. He had spent 33 years in an institution that was communal by definition, and in retirement he had earned the right to be alone, and he exercised that right with the same discipline he'd applied to everything else. But this year's invitation was different. This year's card included a handwritten note on the back, written in a careful, upright script. Sergeant Major Jessup. This year's open house features a display of weapons and equipment from Vietnam-era force reconnaissance operations. Your presence would mean a great deal to the Marines who put it together. Respectfully, Colonel Devereaux. Walter read the note twice. Then he sat at his kitchen table for a long time, looking at the card without seeing it, because the words Vietnam-era force reconnaissance operations had opened a door in his memory that he kept closed for very good reasons. Force recon. The words themselves were a key, and what they unlocked was not a single memory, but an entire architecture of experience. Months of operations in terrain that didn't appear on any map he'd ever been shown. Missions whose objectives were described in briefings that began with the phrase, "This conversation is not happening," and a specific operation in the fall of 1968 that had resulted in the issuance of a campaign ribbon so restricted that its very existence was classified for 23 years after the war ended. Walter had that ribbon. It was pinned to his dress blues, in the correct position, in the correct order of precedence, because in 1991 the classification had been partially lifted and he'd been authorized, quietly, through a letter from the Commandant's office that he kept in a fireproof box in his closet, to wear it on his uniform. He had worn it exactly once, at Cal Polk's funeral. Cal had worn one too. They were, as far as Walter knew, the last 2 living men who had earned it. And now Cal was gone, which meant that the ribbon on Walter's chest might be the only one left in existence outside of a museum case or a widow's jewellery box. He went to the closet that evening and unzipped the garment bag. He looked at the blues. He looked at the ribbon, a narrow strip of dark green and black with a single gold star at the centre, indistinguishable from a distance from a dozen other campaign ribbons, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what it meant. Then he zipped the bag closed and went to bed. But he didn't sleep well. The door was open, and the memories were moving through it, and the question that kept him awake was not whether he should go to the open house, but whether the dress blues still fit. They did. Barely. The waist was tighter than it had been in 2012, and the collar sat higher on his neck because his posture had changed, but the buttons closed and the seams held, and when Walter looked at himself in the bathroom mirror at 7 o'clock on the morning of October 19th, he saw something he hadn't seen in 14 years. A Marine. The Armory Heritage Open House began at 0900. The Armory was a massive building, 60,000 square feet of reinforced concrete and steel, climate-controlled, divided into work bays, storage vaults, and display areas that had been cleared and arranged for the public event. The main display floor held rows of tables and glass cases containing weapons spanning the Corps' history, from Springfield 1903s and M1 Garands to M16A4s, M27 infantry automatic rifles, and the latest optics and suppressors used by Marine infantry and special operations units. There were historical photographs on easels, video screens playing archival footage, and interactive stations where visitors could handle decommissioned weapons under the supervision of active duty armourers. The event had drawn a good crowd. By 9:30 there were approximately 150 people on the floor, families with children, retired Marines in polo shirts and ball caps, a few civilian VIPs from the local government, and a camera crew from the base public affairs office filming for a promotional video. The atmosphere was convivial. Children were picking up inert M16s that weighed almost as much as they did. Wives were taking photographs of their husbands, posing with crew-served weapons they hadn't touched in 20 years. A retired gunnery sergeant was telling a group of wide-eyed 8-year-olds about the time his platoon's M240B jammed during a firefight in Fallujah, editing the story for young ears with the practiced skill of a man who had told it at many backyard barbecues. The event was running smoothly, and the man responsible for it was standing near the centre of the display floor, speaking with a group of local journalists. Colonel Adrian Devereux was 46 years old, 6'1", and built with the economical musculature of a Marine who ran 5 miles every morning and had never stopped. He had served 24 years, infantry officer, Force Reconnaissance Platoon Commander, multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and now commanding the Armory Battalion at Lejeune, which was an assignment that most infantry colonels would have considered a lateral move, but which Devereux had requested specifically because he was a student of military history, and because the Armory was, in his view, the institutional memory of the Corps. Every weapon that had passed through Marine hands for the past century had a record in that building. Every rifle, every pistol, every machine gun. And the stories attached to those weapons were, to Devereux, as important as the weapons themselves. That was why he'd put together the Vietnam-era Force Recon display. It was a passion project. 6 months of research, coordination with the Marine Corps History Division, and the acquisition of artifacts from private collections and unit museums. The display occupied a 30-foot section of the floor and included weapons, equipment, maps, and photographs from force reconnaissance operations conducted between 1965 and 1971, the period in which small teams of Marines had operated deep behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, conducting direct action missions, and performing tasks that the official record described in language so vague it was essentially meaningless. Devereux knew what the vague language concealed. He had studied it for years, driven by a professional curiosity that had begun during his own time in Force Recon and had never abated. He knew the operations, he knew the code names, he knew the ribbons, and he knew that one particular operation, an operation conducted in October of 1968, in a region of Laos that the United States was not officially present in, had produced a campaign ribbon that he had seen exactly once in his career, in a photograph in a classified archive at Quantico, pinned to the chest of a man whose name was redacted. That ribbon was dark green and black with a single gold star. And at 9:47 on the morning of October 19th, Colonel Adrian Devereux looked up from his conversation with the journalists and saw it walk through the door. The room didn't change when Walter Jessup entered. Not immediately. A 79-year-old man in dress blues walking with a cane was notable, but not extraordinary at a military open house. Retired Marines wore their blues to events like this, and the sight of an elderly veteran in uniform was common enough to draw respectful nods but not stares. Walter moved slowly across the threshold, his cane clicking on the polished concrete floor, and paused inside the entrance to orient himself. The display floor was larger than he'd expected, and the crowd was denser, and for a moment he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has been alone for too long and is suddenly surrounded by noise and movement and the casual proximity of strangers. But he steadied himself the way he'd always steadied himself, by focusing on a single point and moving toward it. The single point was the Vietnam-era display, which he could see across the floor, and he began walking toward it. He didn't get there. He made it approximately 30 feet into the building before Colonel Devereux intercepted him. Intercepted is the correct word, though Devereux would not have described it that way. What happened was this. Devereux saw the dress blues first, then the cane, then the age, then, as the distance between them closed, the ribbons. Devereux's eyes moved across Walter's ribbon rack with the trained speed of a Marine officer who had spent years studying uniform regulations and unit citations, and his brain processed what he was seeing in the order that a brain processes the impossible. First denial, then confusion, then recognition, then a physical response that he could not control. He stopped walking. His hands, which had been holding a coffee cup and a program booklet, went still. The colour in his face changed, not dramatically, not the theatrical draining that happens in movies, but a subtle shift in the blood beneath the skin, a redirection of circulation that accompanies genuine shock. Because there it was. 3rd row, 4th position from the inboard edge, exactly where it should be according to the order of precedence established by the Classification Review in 1991. Dark green, black, single gold star. The ribbon that Devereux had seen exactly once in his life, in a photograph, attached to a chest whose owner's name had been blacked out with a government marker. And here it was again, on a living man, walking toward him across the floor of his armory. Devereux closed the distance in 4 strides. He positioned himself directly in front of Walter, not aggressively, but with the unmistakable intentionality of a man who needed to see something up close before he could believe it. Walter stopped. He looked at the colonel. He saw the rank, the insignia, the Force Recon pin on Devereux's chest, and something in Walter's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition. Not of the man, but of the type. Walter knew Force Recon officers. He had served under them. He had carried them on stretchers. He had watched them make decisions that killed people and saved people, and sometimes did both simultaneously. He knew what that pin meant, and he knew what the look in Devereux's eyes meant because he'd seen it before. The look of a man who has just encountered something he thought existed only in archives and briefing rooms. "Sergeant Major," Devereux said. His voice was controlled but tight, like a rope under tension. "Colonel," Walter replied. Devereux's eyes hadn't left the ribbon. He was staring at it with the fixed intensity of a man looking at a piece of history that had walked off the wall and started breathing. "That ribbon," Devereux said. "I know what that is." "Then you know more than most people," Walter said. There was no challenge in his voice, no pride, just a statement of fact delivered with the flat, unadorned directness that characterized everything Walter Jessup said. Devereux looked at Walter's face, then at the ribbon again, then at the room around them, the families, the children, the journalists, the cameras. He made a decision. It took less than 3 seconds, and it was the kind of decision that career officers are trained to make, rapid, definitive, and irreversible. He turned to his executive officer, a major named Chen who was standing 6 feet away, and said, "Clear the room," Major Chen blinked. "Sir?" "Clear the room. Everybody out. Close the doors." "Sir, the open house is scheduled until—" "Now, Major." The authority in Devereux's voice was absolute. It was not anger. It was not panic. It was command, the kind that permits no discussion because the person issuing it has already calculated every variable and determined that obedience is the only acceptable outcome. Chen moved. He was efficient about it. He recruited 4 staff NCOs, and within 90 seconds the display floor was being emptied. Families were guided politely toward the exits. The journalists were told the event would resume shortly. The camera crew was asked to stop filming, and through all of it, Walter Jessup stood in the center of the armory floor, leaning on his cane, watching the evacuation with the calm of a man who had been in rooms that were cleared for far more urgent reasons than the one on his chest. When the last civilian was out and the doors were closed, the armory floor held 5 people: Walter, Devereux, Major Chen, and 2 master sergeants who served as the battalion's senior armourers, and whom Devereux trusted implicitly. The space was enormous, and suddenly very quiet. The kind of quiet that fills large rooms when they're emptied of purpose, where the absence of noise becomes its own presence. Devereux pulled a chair from behind one of the display tables and set it across from Walter. "Please sit down, Sergeant Major." Walter sat. Devereux sat across from him. The 2 master sergeants stood at a respectful distance. Major Chen remained by the door. "I need to ask you something," Devereux said, "and I need you to understand why I'm asking." "Go ahead." "That ribbon. 3rd row, 4th from the left. Dark green, black field, single gold star device. I know which one you're talking about, Colonel. Operation Limestone Creek." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Walter didn't flinch. He didn't react at all, which was itself a reaction. The non-reaction of a man who had trained himself decades ago to receive information without displaying its effect. "I didn't say the name," Walter said. "No, I said it. And I'm saying it because I've spent 6 years researching force reconnaissance operations in Laos during 1967 and 1968, and I've read every declassified file, every after-action report, and every interview transcript that exists. And in all of that research, I've never spoken to a living participant." He paused. "Because as far as the official record indicates, there are no living participants." Walter was quiet for a long time. The silence in the armory had a weight to it, the weight of classified histories, of operations that happened in places the United States was not supposed to be. of young men who crossed borders that didn't exist on the maps they were given and did things that would never appear in any citation or commendation or history book. The record's not wrong about most of them, Walter said finally. How many were there? On Limestone Creek specifically, the insert team was 12, 6 recon Marines, 4 indigenous personnel, 2 agency advisors. And now, I'm the last. The word last hung in the air between them. It was a word that carried the full weight of 56 years. 56 years during which 11 other men had died, some in the operation itself, some in subsequent operations, some in the decades after the war from wounds and exposures, and the slow, grinding attrition of bodies and minds that had been pushed past their design specifications. The last. Walter Jessup was the last man alive who had walked into the mountains of Laos in October of 1968, on an operation that officially never happened, to accomplish an objective that was still partially classified, wearing a ribbon that fewer than 40 men had ever been authorized to pin on their chest. Devereux sat with that information for a moment. He was a professional. He was trained in intelligence handling, classified material protocols, and the particular ethical framework that governed the discussion of sensitive operations with personnel who had been involved in them. He knew that what Walter could tell him was bounded by classification, that there were things Walter might want to say and couldn't, things he could say but wouldn't, and things he would only say to someone who had demonstrated the right to hear them. Sergeant Major, I want you to know that I didn't clear this room to interrogate you. I cleared it because what you're wearing on your chest is something that no one in this building has the clearance to see in context. The families, the journalists, the cameras, none of them would know what that ribbon means. But if anyone in this room photographs it, and it ends up in a newspaper or on the internet, someone at Quantico or Langley is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation. And I don't want that conversation to happen to you. Walter looked at him. It was a look of assessment, the slow, careful evaluation of a man who had spent a career determining who could be trusted and who could not, in environments where the wrong determination was fatal. You cleared the room to protect me, Walter said. Yes. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Something shifted in Walter's face, not a smile. Walter Jessup did not smile casually, but a softening, a release of tension that had been held so long it had become part of the architecture of his expression. He had walked into this building expecting to look at some old rifles and leave. He had not expected to be seen. Not the surface seeing, the nods and the thank you for your service platitudes that veterans receive from well-meaning strangers. The real seeing, the kind where someone looks at what you carry and understands what it cost. What do you want to know, Colonel? Walter asked. Devereux leaned forward. Only what you're willing to tell me, and only if you want to tell it, Walter told him. Not everything. Not the operational details that remained classified, the specific coordinates, the agency personnel, the objective. But he told him the shape of it. He told him about the insert, 12 men loaded onto a helicopter that had no markings, flown by pilots who used call signs that didn't correspond to any unit in the theatre, crossing a border at 3 a.m. into a country where they did not exist. He told him about the terrain, mountains so steep and jungle so dense that the canopy closed over their heads like a lid, and the only light for 3 days was what filtered through leaves and cloud cover. He told him about the march, 47 kilometres over ground that would have been difficult for young men without packs, covered by 12 men carrying 60 to 80 pounds each, in conditions of absolute noise discipline, where a cough or a stumble could end not just the mission but their lives. He told him about the contact, not in detail because the detail was still classified, but in effect. Things went wrong. Things always went wrong. The plan was one thing, the reality was another. Men were hit. Decisions were made in seconds that would be debated in briefing rooms for years. And through all of it, Walter, then a staff sergeant 23 years old on his second deployment, had done what sergeants do. He kept his Marines moving, kept them fighting, kept them alive when the machinery of the operation broke down, and all that remained was the will and discipline of the men on the ground. They lost 3 on the insert team, 2 Marines and 1 of the indigenous personnel. The bodies were carried out, all of them, 7 kilometres through mountain jungle in the dark, because you don't leave your people, not ever, not for any reason, not even when carrying them means you might not make it out yourself. Walter carried one of them, a lance corporal from Michigan named David Pruitt, who was 20 years old and who had been hit in the chest by a round that should have killed him instantly but didn't. So Walter carried him for 4 hours while Pruitt breathed in a way that Walter could still hear 56 years later. A wet, shallow sound that got quieter, mile by mile, until it stopped entirely at the extraction point, 11 minutes before the helicopter arrived. Walter had held him the entire time, held him as a living man and then as a dead man, and the transition between the two was so gradual that Walter couldn't have told you the exact moment it happened. He just knew that at some point the breathing stopped and the weight changed. Not the physical weight, which was the same, but the other weight. The weight that living bodies have and dead bodies don't. And that difference was the heaviest thing Walter Jessup had ever carried. He told Devereaux this, not in dramatic language, not with tears, in the flat, precise, factual cadence of a man delivering an after-action report to someone who had earned the right to receive it. And Devereaux listened the way a good officer listens, without interruption, without reaction, without the performative empathy that civilians offer when they hear war stories and don't know what to do with them. He listened the way you listen to something sacred, because that's what it was. When Walter finished, the armory was very quiet. Major Chen had moved closer at some point during the telling, not to hear better, but because the story had a gravity that pulled people toward it. The two master sergeants stood in the same positions they'd been in for 30 minutes, and neither of them had shifted their weight once. Devereaux sat in silence for a full 10 seconds after Walter stopped speaking. Then he said, "Sergeant Major, I have something to show you, and I think it's why you were meant to be here today." He stood and walked to the Vietnam-era Force Recon display. Walter followed, slowly, his cane marking time on the concrete. Devereaux led him to a glass case at the far end of the display, a case that Walter hadn't seen when he'd entered, because he'd been intercepted before reaching it. Inside the case, arranged on black velvet, were personal effects and equipment from Vietnam-era Force reconnaissance operations. Dog tags, a compass, a map case, a K-bar knife with a handle worn smooth, and in the centre of the display a photograph. The photograph was black and white, creased from folding, slightly overexposed in the way that field photographs from the 1960s often were. It showed 12 men standing in front of a helicopter. They were young. They were lean. They were wearing fatigues that didn't match and carrying weapons that weren't standard issue, and their faces had the expression that men's faces have when they're about to do something they're not sure they'll survive. Walter stopped walking. His cane stopped moving. His hand, the one with the tremor, went still. Completely still. The tremor arrested by something stronger than the nerve damage that caused it. He stared at the photograph. "Where did you get this?" His voice was different now, lower, rougher, as if the words were being pushed through something that didn't want to let them pass. "Marine Corps History Division," Devereaux said. "It was in a collection of unattributed photographs from the Da Nang press office. It wasn't classified because nobody knew what it was. No names, no unit designation, no date. Just 12 men and a helicopter." "I know what it is," Walter said. "That's us. That's Limestone Creek. That's the team." He pointed. His finger was steady despite the tremor. "That's me, second from left, and that—" His finger moved to a young man standing third from right, shorter than the others, with a face that was half turned from the camera as if he'd been caught mid-laugh. "That's Pruitt. That's David." The silence in the armory was total. Not even the building's ventilation system seemed to be running. 5 people stood around a glass case containing a photograph that had been unidentified for 56 years, and the only man alive who could identify it was standing in front of them in dress blues with a campaign ribbon on his chest that proved he'd been there. Devereaux spoke first. "Sergeant Major, with your permission, I'd like to do 2 things. First, I'd like to formally identify this photograph with your name, the operation name as authorized by the current classification status and the date. It would be the first positively identified photograph of a Limestone Creek participant in any Marine Corps collection." Walter nodded slowly. He was still looking at the photograph, at Pruitt, at the face of a 20-year-old lance corporal who had been dead for 56 years and who had just appeared, grinning, in a glass case in an armory in North Carolina, as if he'd been waiting there the whole time for someone who knew his name to come and say it. "Second," Devereaux continued, "I'd like to nominate your service record for inclusion in the Force Reconnaissance Heritage Archive at Quantico. It's a classified archive that documents the operational histories of Force Recon Marines whose service records are incomplete due to classification restrictions. Your record, what can be documented, would ensure that what you and your team did is preserved for future Marines to study. Not the classified details, but the fact of it. The fact that 12 men went into those mountains and 9 came out, and that the operation accomplished its objective, and that the men who didn't come home were carried out by the men who did. Walter didn't respond for a long time. He was looking at the photograph, and what he was seeing was not a historical artifact. He was seeing Cal Polk, who was standing on the far right with his arms crossed, and who had died in 2012. He was seeing Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Lau, who was standing in the centre with a radio on his back, and who had been killed in Hugh City 4 months after this photograph was taken. He was seeing the 2 agency advisors, whose names he had never known, and whose faces he had never forgotten, standing slightly apart from the Marines in the way that agency men always stood. Close enough to be part of it, far enough to deny it. He was seeing David Pruitt caught mid-laugh, alive and whole, 3 days before a bullet would end him on a mountainside in a country he wasn't supposed to be in, on an operation that wouldn't exist for another 23 years. His family, Walter said. Pruitt's. Do they know what happened? Devereux hesitated. The official record lists Lance Corporal Pruitt as killed in action during a reconnaissance operation in the Republic of Vietnam. The specifics, the location, the operation name, are still restricted. His mother came to see me, Walter said. 1971. She drove from Michigan to Camp Lejeune. She sat in my living room and asked me how her son died, and I couldn't tell her. I sat across from that woman and I lied to her. I told her what the official notification said, that he was killed during a patrol. I couldn't tell her where. I couldn't tell her why. I couldn't tell her that I carried him. I couldn't tell her that he was alive for 4 hours after he was hit and that I held him the entire time, and that the last thing he said was, "Tell my mum I wasn't scared." I couldn't tell her any of it, and she looked at me. She looked at me like she knew I was lying, Colonel. She knew, and she drove back to Michigan without her son and without the truth, and she died in 2003 never knowing what really happened. The armory was silent. Major Chen had turned away. One of the master sergeants had his jaw set in the particular way that men set their jaws when they are determined not to react visibly to something that is breaking them. Devereux's face was still, controlled, but his eyes were not. His eyes held the thing that his training kept off his face. The recognition that what he was hearing was not a war story but a wound, still open after 56 years, still bleeding in the quiet way that old wounds bleed when they've never been properly treated. The classification status of that specific detail, the personal communications of participants, was downgraded in 2014, Devereux said carefully, which means that what Lance Corporal Pruitt said to you is no longer restricted. Walter looked at him. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that if Pruitt's family, siblings, nieces, nephews, anyone, if they're alive and reachable, you can tell them. You can tell them what he said. You can tell them what you did. You can tell them the truth. Walter closed his eyes. He stood there in the armory, in his dress blues, with his cane and his tremor and 56 years of silence, and he closed his eyes, and the 5 people in that room understood that they were witnessing something private, something that was not for them, something that was happening between Walter Jessup and a memory that had been locked in a classified box for more than half a century, and was, at this moment, being released. He opened his eyes. "I'll need help finding them," he said. "I don't know where the family ended up." "I'll make it happen," Devereux said. "Personally." He meant it. There was no ambiguity in his voice, no bureaucratic hedge. He would find them. He would connect Walter to the family of a man who had died in his arms in 1968. And Walter would finally deliver the message he'd been carrying for 56 years. Because some messages don't expire. Some messages are more durable than classification stamps and government secrecy, and the slow erosion of decades. Some messages survive because the person carrying them refuses to set them down. The open house resumed at 11:30. The doors were reopened. The families and journalists returned. The camera crew started filming again. Nothing had visibly changed. The displays were the same, the floor was the same, the crowd was the same. But the photograph in the glass case at the end of the Force Recon display now had a small placard in front of it that had not been there before. It read, "Insert Team, Operation Limestone Creek, October the 1968. Photograph identified by Sergeant Major Walter J. Jessup, USMC, Retiast, sole surviving participant. 12 men. 9 came home. 1 was still here." And for the first time in 56 years they had a name on the glass. Walter stayed for the rest of the open house. He hadn't planned to. He'd planned to see the display and leave, and instead he'd been seen, and the being seen had changed the calculus of the day in ways he hadn't anticipated. He stood near the Force Recon display, not because anyone asked him to, but because leaving felt wrong. The photograph was there, and the men in it were there in the only way they could still be there, and Walter felt an obligation to stand with them that he couldn't have articulated and didn't try to. People came to him, not many. He didn't draw attention to himself, and the placard on the display case didn't mention that the man who'd identified the photograph was in the building. But a few visitors noticed the dress blues, noticed the ribbon rack, noticed the way he stood near the case with the concentration of someone standing guard rather than someone browsing, and they approached. A retired gunnery sergeant shook his hand and said nothing, which was exactly right. A young lieutenant stopped, read the placard, looked at Walter, and saluted. A crisp, parade ground salute that Walter returned with the automatic precision of muscle memory 33 years deep. And a woman in her 60s, who had been walking through the display with her husband, stopped in front of the photograph and stared at it for a long time, then turned to Walter and said, "Did you know these men?" "Yes, Mum," Walter said. "All of them." "What happened to them?" Walter looked at the photograph. 12 faces. Young. Certain in the way that young men are certain before the thing that makes them uncertain. "They served," Walter said, "and the ones who came home brought the ones who didn't." The woman looked at him, and something in her expression said that she understood. Not the specifics, not the operation, not the classified history, but the core of it, the weight of it. The fact that this old man in his dress blues was carrying something that most people couldn't lift, and he was carrying it standing up. She thanked him. She moved on. Walter stayed. 6 weeks later, Colonel Devereux called Walter at home. He had located David Pruitt's family. His sister, Ellen Pruitt Weston, was alive and living in Traverse City, Michigan. She was 74 years old. She had been 16 when her brother died. Devereux had spoken to her by phone, explained who he was, explained that a fellow Marine who had served with David wanted to speak with her, and she had said yes before he finished the sentence. She had been waiting 56 years for that call. Walter drove to Michigan. He did not fly. He didn't trust airplanes and never had, which was ironic for a man who had ridden helicopters into places that would have terrified most pilots. He drove his Silverado north for 14 hours, stopped overnight in Ohio, and arrived in Traverse City on a Thursday afternoon in early December. Ellen Pruitt Weston met him at her front door. She was small, white-haired, with eyes that looked like her brother's. Walter saw it immediately. The same shape, the same brightness, the genetic echo of a face he'd last seen in the dark on a mountainside in Laos. They sat in her living room. She offered coffee. He accepted. And then he told her. He told her everything he was authorized to tell her, and some things he probably wasn't, because after 56 years the distinction between classified and necessary had ceased to matter to him. He told her that David had been brave, not the general all-purpose bravery that casualty notifications describe, but specifically brave in specific moments, in ways that Walter could narrate because he had been there. He told her about the march and the contact and the 4 hours he'd carried her brother through the mountains. He told her that David had been conscious for most of it. He told her that David had not been in great pain, which was not entirely true but was the kind of lie that Walter considered a duty rather than a deception. And then he told her what David had said. He said, "Tell my mum I wasn't scared." Ellen Pruitt Weston sat very still in her chair. The coffee on the table between them had stopped steaming. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the December wind moved through bare trees in a sound that was almost like breathing. "My mother went to her grave believing he died alone," Ellen said. "He didn't. I was with him. He was held. He wasn't alone for 1 second." Ellen looked at Walter for a long time. Then she stood, walked to a shelf on the far wall, and took down a frame photograph. It was David Pruitt, the same face from the Armory photograph, but younger, in a high school portrait wearing a tie and a cautious smile. She handed it to Walter. "My mother kept this on her nightstand until the day she died," Ellen said. "I'd like you to have it." Walter took the photograph. He held it the way he'd held David, carefully, completely, with both hands. "I'll put it where I can see it," he said. He did. The photograph of David Pruitt sits on the shelf above the workbench in Walter Jessup's garage, next to a Purple Heart, a bronze star with Valor device, and a campaign ribbon, dark green, black field, single gold star, that has no official name, no public history, and no meaning to anyone who hasn't earned the right to know what it represents. Walter sees it every morning when he walks to his truck. He doesn't stop. He doesn't linger. He gives it the same brief nod he gives the flag on his porch, the acknowledgement of a man who carries his debts visibly and settles them when he can. The message has been delivered. 56 years late, but delivered. And David Pruitt, who was 20 years old and caught mid-laugh in a photograph that no one could identify, is no longer unnamed. He is known, he is held, and he was not scared. If this story reminded you that some sacrifices stay classified long after they should, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of veterans who carried the weight of service in silence. Not because they wanted to, but because they were ordered to. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And if you know a veteran who's been carrying something for a long time, tell them it's okay to set it down. Some messages were never meant to stay locked away forever.